Well, we're going to continue the discussion on frame rate, high frame rate, with Doug Trumbull and technology expert Ray Feeney and Johannes Stur of ARRI. And actually tomorrow morning in the Gloria Theater #1 at 9 a.m., Johannes is going to show some material showing differential frame rates and some other footage shot at 120 frames, or just the differential?
Actually, we don't have 120 frame playback there, so I can show something that has been captured at 120 frames per second, but only played back at 24 frames per second.
All right, thank you. So Doug, that was a very compelling case made for higher frame rate along with everything else. What are the challenges now technically and aesthetically to make this happen? And in particular with Peter Jackson working right now on The Hobbit, what can be done? Because certainly when they showed the footage a couple of weeks ago at CinemaCon, there were quite a number of people who were wowed and a lot of other people who were a little freaked out by what they saw. And Peter subsequently reassured that there are things that can be done to make adjustments to it, to refine it. It's a tool in progress.
You want me to talk?
Yeah, why don't you start?
You want to talk, Ray?
No, you do it first.
That's great.
Well, having messed with high frame rates for many, many years, I fully understand this weird live quality. It's kind of soap opera. That's a derogatory term, but as a vividness to higher frame rates. The higher you go, the more vivid it gets. It's a moving target. And I just think Peter Jackson is my hero for doing it, for having the guts to do it against the will of the industry. And I really wish him the best. And I think that audiences are going to acclimate to this over time. I think they're going to realize, once they see it at 48 frames and they complain, and then they go back and look at it 24s, they say, oh, yeah, actually 48 was better for a lot of reasons. But it's not just frame rates. I mean, this is a frame rate thing. This is not a screen size or a brightness debate. But the other part of your question, for me, is that frame rates evoke this whole other cinematic language because you're heading into first-person territory. You're heading into experiential cinema territory, which is a whole other way of telling a story. I just don't think you take a regular directorial style and shoot it at 60 or 48 or 120 and expect as much to happen as could. I mean, there's really wild stuff you can do in terms of the relationship between the audience and actors, for instance, and eye contact and immediacy and provocative fear, and all kinds of stuff can happen at high frame rates.
Well, just looking again at the brainstorm footage, I just imagine what that would be like.
That was the idea. It was a big disappointment for me, and so my disappointment about the whole brainstorm story and the inability of the industry to flex, to embrace something new, just really floored me completely. And I just stopped directing. I said, I got to find another way. And I found another way. I did the Back to the Future ride, which was an extremely immersive cinematic experience where you're in the movie, and that was a gas. We just had a ball making that movie.
Have you started to think about the change in language and what you would do?
Oh yeah, I'm writing. I have a screenplay already written for this new storytelling form, but I don't really know. I can't even guess exactly what I will do as a director, and that's why I've set up the stage and the screen right next to each other, so I can put the camera on actors in an environment, get it up on the screen, walk 20 feet, and see the result right away, and try things. That's when the new language will start to emerge, and only then will anybody be able to experiment with different kinds of moves, different kinds of framing, different kind of dynamics, different on-camera, off-camera relationships. That's the whole thing. It's kind of like the Back to the Future ride. You got to get your dailies right away. In this case, we're going to try to get our dailies within 2 frames of latency.
Johannes, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing at ARRI with the cameras and and all the other technology that's going to help make this happen and what you've discovered so far.
Yeah, Ari moved into the digital age with the cameras, with the Alexa 2 years ago, and it's a tremendously successful product. I don't want to talk about this part of the business or the business part of it at all. We got quite some experience on problems with moving into digital acquisition that is related to the frame rates and to motion blur, motion shutter. Some just related to 2D capturing, some related to 3D capturing, which makes some things a lot worse. And when you start thinking about these things, you figure out there might be different solutions or different ways to go. And one way definitely is, as there are motion blur, motion shutter effects that are not really pleasing to the audience, why not move to higher frame rates? And as the camera was designed to run at 120 frames per second, basically from the original design, and we achieved to run the camera at 120 frames per second since maybe half a year. There's a lot of room to test and to play around and to see what the capabilities are, and also to figure out what the benefits are to go to higher frame rates. So I personally, and in my group, we did some of these studies, and I'll be talking in more detail tomorrow morning about some of the results. So that's the first answer now.
Ray, why don't you tell us what you think about all of this? You're up on all the technology and what the ramifications are of going to a higher frame rate and how it impacts the overall filmmaking process and the experience of watching these.
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of what Doug's been doing with the 120 frame, 360-degree shutter and the ability to synthesize any kind of feel and mix and match within a single individual frame, basically variable frame rate. I think that that's going to have a huge impact. And I also completely understand that from the days of 2001, Doug has always wanted to take us along on a journey as part of the filmmaking, along with various directors that he's been involved with. He's had a singular point of view, and I think that some of these technologies will finally enable him to do some of the things that he envisioned way ahead of his time. But in addition to that, I think we're going to see significant changes to movie making in general. I think I agree with Doug that today's exhibition experience is severely challenged, particularly with the rapid evolution in the home. And we're also seeing significant rapid evolution in the digital tools that we have for capture and digital cameras. And one of the things that I've been involved with a lot of work right now on trying to envision where next generation cinema might go, and working with some of the engineers from the major camera manufacturers like Sony and Canon that are pushing spatial resolution. And what happens is, as soon as the spatial resolution goes up, then as soon as you move the camera versus a static shot, or even in some shots with objects moving through the frame, everything just changes it dramatically and in a jarring way to take you out of the story, out of the picture. So we're seeing, NHK as with Samsung and the others have put the 8K panels that they've been showing as part of the ultra high definition stuff into actual volume production. We're going to see all sorts of things that just become part of the norm, whether they're used as computer display terminals or other forms of entertainment, gaming, things like that. Filmmaking will have to adjust in order to be part of the genre. So frame rates is one of those pieces. And the way that I kind of just try to describe it to people is in the area of lenses, because lenses were an analog thing and they were in front of the camera, we were able to evolve slowly from the days of the old lenses or a super Baltar type lens all the way up to the Zeiss Master Primes and the new Leicas that are phenomenal. 98% of the time when a cinematographer wants to go out on major motion pictures, he wants the best lens package that he can have. But then he controls the nature of what that brings to the image, in this case with filters and things like that in front of the lens, but he likes to have that capability when he needs to pull that thing and do stuff. We've never had that freedom with frame rate. We've been locked into, in the cellular world, this 24-frame kind of environment. So now we're opening up this, and it'd be sort of like we were living with super Baltar lenses for 60 years, and somebody invented the Zeiss Master Prime. You show it to cinematographers, or you show it to people, and they go, whoa, I could never shoot an actress like that. It's flawed. That will never work. But because they developed the vocabulary over time, as there were small incremental changes, nobody's scared of lens technology. I think frame rate's exactly the same thing, except it came in one fell swoop. So what we're gonna have to do is learn to control it in a creative way, because I'm very interested in what it can bring to the creative process of storytelling. And I think we've only begun to scratch the surface. And I agree we need to start somewhere. I think Peter Jackson should be given a medal. But for people who don't like what they happen to see, I would caution them not to confuse frame rate used with as a creative tool with this particular first cut of using frame rate primarily to drive solving a technical problem of fusing stereo and providing a more immersive environment for his particular storytelling. But I think we shouldn't read too much into the very first project, except to applaud it and look at what we can do and how we can explore these ideas, because there's an avalanche of evolution coming in the kind of tools that we have available. And if we don't use them in the movie industry will tend to fade. At least exhibition will tend to fade. So?
Well, it was very encouraging in the last couple of years in terms of stereoscopic filmmaking that you had top directors willing to take a chance with it and experiment with it and inspire their creativity. So there's no reason to think that they would take the opportunity to do the same with another puzzle in the toolbox, a higher frame rate.
And I have a great deal of faith with the very smart people at Weta that they will figure out a mechanism that allows the movie to flow. I know Doug and others have been chatting, and there's plenty of refinements that I would expect to happen before the movie actually hits final release. And I'm very, very optimistic that it'll be a launch pad for experimentation going forward.
Could you go into a little bit more detail of what the experience would be like varying the frame rate, what that would mean in terms of as a viewing experience? What would change, what wouldn't change?
I'll make a cut at that first, because one of the things that I talk about, I think that the demo that Doug showed with the fight sequence and everything is very informative for many people who can visualize and get it from there. But when I talk to people, part of what I use as an example is, imagine if you wanted some sort of, alien monster movie that you don't want to go make, battle, but you could have the humans that we're used to seeing and things like that in, again, the projector's updating, let's say at 120 frames per second. The humans that are battling the monster could all be working at a synthesized 24 frame, looking totally normal, like we've used to seeing humans in perspective in a movie. And the alien monster that's being battled could be at 60 or 72 or 120 and have a presence that we never had before. Or if somebody wanted to do a new, we'll show my age, wolf vision, point of view of something, or a new predator camouflage kind of technique that, the variable frame rate opens itself up as a creative tool, not just for that, point of view perspective, but to allow a kind of storytelling tool that we've never had before.
Now, even though it's being discussed as a way of solving a technical problem with stereoscopic presentation with motion artifacts, it obviously doesn't have to be confined to 3D.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm trying to bring into the discussion equation is not screen size per se. A lot of people think, well, a bigger screen is better than a smaller screen. That's not exactly the point I'm trying to make. There's a very weird phenomena that happens, not a weird phenomenon, it's just what happens with 3D, is that in stereoscopic perception, the size and shape of the screen is not a factor any longer because the depth perception is what it is. And if it's done well, it'll be natural. But one of the things that I want to bring into the discussion is, for example, if you had a certain screen at a certain distance, whenever I go into a movie theater or look at somebody's giant screen TV, I go like that, and I say, well, that screen is one of Doug's widths wide. Or I go like that, and I say, well, that's 2 of Doug's widths wide. That's kind of my rule of thumb, so to speak, because it's field of view. Mm-hmm. It's not size. I could be close to a small screen, and it's still a big field of view. So one of the things about movies that you have to think about when you're thinking about movies are a series of still photographs. They're displaced from one position to the next as an object moves across the screen or as the camera pans. So example, if I'm looking at a movie that's one of Doug's widths wide and it's at 24 frames and some object moves across the screen and I could measure it on the screen from one frame to the next as a 1 inch or 1 centimeter motion. If I double the size of the screen, it's going to be 2 inches or 2 centimeters displacement, which is going to start to look bad. That's where the blurring and strobing comes into place. And it's particularly exaggerated by multiple flashing. Because what happens is a moving object enters your retina and registers as an image, and then it's flashed again, and then it holds your retina, but your eye may be watching a moving object. I study this all the time. I'm kind of a geek about it, but your retina is retaining all these multiple images superimposed on each other, and it looks like what we call judder. But if you, for instance, increase the width of the screen, you doubled it, and then you just doubled the frame rate, you would still have 1 inch or 1 centimeter displacement per frame, which should look exactly appropriate. So it's what we're seeing that people are not talking about is when we do a demo of 4K versus 2K, we always show it on a bigger screen. And it shows up all the flaws of the frame rate.
It's magnifying.
It's magnifying the flaws of the frame rate. So there's a kind of proportionality rule that should be invoked, which is as the screen size increases, the frame rate should increase, or the resolution should increase, or the brightness should increase, or the bit depth, or the color gamut. All kinds of things can be proportioned to screen size and that sense of immersion. And when you get into the world of flight simulation, which I geekify in all the time, anybody in flight simulation knows you've got to have a really wide field of view to have a sense of immersion. And it's that peripheral horizontal field of view that was so important in IMAX and Cinerama. And that's something I'd like to see come back, at least for certain movies. It's not for all movies. High frame rate is not for all movies. The nice thing is 24 frames is great.
Yes.
None of us are threatening 24 frames. I think it's a beautiful palette, it's a beautiful style, it's a beautiful art form that thousands of creative individuals do very well. And we're not threatening that, we're trying to change that. But we're saying we can add other content by virtue of frame rates or resolution or field of view for a different kind of movie.
Johannes, you were going to say something.
I think when our industry moved into this wave of 3D imaging, it's basically, I would say Avatar is really the big feature film that didn't start the wave, but it was really making the most splash or had the most impact. I think we faced the problem, or we're now seeing that we face the problem that the whole system from capture to display was not really fully thought of and well balanced. I always heard at the Digital Cinema Summit at NAB for many years, 3D will be the killer application for digital cinema. And it definitely was, because when the 3D features, Avatar and others came out, then many theaters quickly moved from analog projection to digital projection. But the problem I'm seeing is that the whole system is not well balanced. It's similar to what you are saying, Doug. If you're presenting 3D through one projector and you're projecting both eyes not simultaneously, but one eye after another, then the way of presentation is not equivalent to the way of capture, and that causes some kind of eye strain. So I think we need to re-establish or to rethink all these elements in the chain to make sure that they match, that they are balanced with each other. And as said earlier, one way to move in that direction is to go at higher frame rates. But I see another aspect of the higher frame rates, which is very basic to our human vision. When we started analyzing those differences between 24 frames presentation and 48 frames presentation or higher frame rates, then something really occurs pretty suddenly. So if you're watching at 48 frames per second and higher any moving objects or panning cameras, all the motion chatter is gone that you still would see with 24 frames per second. So if I look at that from a scientific point of view, then I would say from 48 frames per second onwards to higher frame rates, we have a completely different kind of perception. It's not this perception of motion chatter for objects that move around. And of course, that opens a creative question. Do we want to get rid of this motion chatter from a creative perspective, or is that part of the grammar, how you want to tell stories? But from a human vision point of view, and I would say also from a technical point of view for a camera manufacturer, it's a good thing to be in a position to offer higher frame rates for many purposes, even if you reconstruct or synthesize, like you suggest, in your work and your patents, to playback at 24 frames per second, but to give the scene a different time of motion rendition than it could originally be captured if we just work at 24 frames per second.
What is this going to do for, well, you said data is cheap, but what about data wrangling and rendering and the impact on visual effects?
I think that there's probably a lot of Weta guys here, and I've been having discussions with them about it because I asked them the question. I said, well, if we're going to shoot 5 times as many frames, is that a big problem for you or is it not a big problem? Well, obviously it is a problem. I don't think it's an insurmountable problem because it is just more data. Mm-hmm. And I have my stupid attitude, which is that it's still cheaper than 70 millimeter film, so it doesn't frighten me. I think there's a lot of things that are being enabled every day in the post-production pipeline, particularly in the visual effects field, that are extremely sophisticated, extremely electronically driven and enabled. And I think this is just one of the things that we should get a grip on and have some standards for and give some tools for so that everybody can do it properly. I mean, one of the things that I have been on about as well is this whole kind of temporal issue that you were talking about, which is that if you let's say you shot a movie at 120 frames a second. This is one of the things I've been doing recently. I shoot 2 streams of data at 120 frames a second. They're synchronized perfectly. What I found is I can take all the even number of frames from the left eye and all the odd number of frames from the right eye and project them temporally in sequence because the projector is alternating left eye temporally. So I can actually be projecting a 60-frame movie, but it's 120 frames of temporal information that's accurate. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So an object that's moving is flowing from position to position to position evenly and correctly in temporal and time. Whereas if you take a movie at 48 frames a second, like The Hobbit is right now, those frames are being shown twice. So there's no way to get them temporarily offset. They're being projected twice and then twice, and so there's no way to get it there. There's a threshold at 60 frames where you can project each frame only once. And you have to tell the projector that that's what you want, a single flash, that gets you smoothness of motion. I don't know if everybody wants smoothness of motion because it may not be great for a love story. Might be terrible for pornos. I don't know.
I think also, even though this is a frame rate panel, many of us, and Doug was talking about it in his presentation, really feel that in order to bring the spectacle back, it's many things. And one of those things that's clearly visible to people is high dynamic range. You know, higher brightness images on the screen with extended dynamic range, much more brilliant highlights, much more extended color gamut and things like that to just come automatically for free when you work at, you know, high brightness in the projector, but don't make the images all that much brighter, using the extra room for the more realistic extended range of what's there in the image. And the 24 frame compromise that we had in the industry was based on a certain brightness. And that brightness was capped because of the multi, you know, shutter blinking alternating with black of 24 frame celluloid projection. And now that we have these other tools, in addition to which everybody wants to watch various media anytime, anyway, we're going to be putting things on much brighter devices. Those might be like an iPad or bigger, you know, home 80-inch screens, whatever. But it would be my expectation that in order to have, with some of these other pieces added together, in order to have the same apparent lyrical feel that people describe 24 frame having, with different dynamic ranges and different brightnesses, that may actually occur at a frame rate other than 24. So although we have all sorts of cinematographers and directors saying, I'm in love with 24, what they're actually saying is they're in love with the feel that they view as cinematic that's actually happening. Another thing that's key is many cinematographers I know, as part of their look, they do things. And it's not uncommon for people to be shooting at 26 frames per second and playing back at 24 in order to give that actress a certain more graceful feel or any of the rest of it. It wouldn't surprise me, and there's a lot of work that still should be done, but for instance, it wouldn't surprise me if shooting at 52 frames per second and playing back at 48 might not take some of the curse off. I mean, so I think that there's quite a bit of experimentation in order to build this vocabulary, but I caution people to be aware of just lumping things into these topics like high frame rate or 24 frame or anything. It's shorthand for a certain feel, but because everything is changing, that feel may be accomplished going forward in totally different ways to give you that. I mean, in the beginning when we were having these new flat panels at home and all that, the directors were adamant that everything needed to be done to exactly match the theater. And you had this cinema mode on your home TV that put it into dull and dingy mode, okay, where it went down to the low brightness and the low capability that we were stuck with in the theaters. People quickly learned that that was not the right way to do it, that you could make the cinema feel on movies that you presented in the home at the brightness that televisions were actually able to be driven. I think that that kind of lesson is something that we're going to have happen instantaneously as soon as we can really get out there and explore with the tools. But as Doug has said, we need capability that isn't everybody building it from the ground up. We need these post-production tools that, you know, for instance, quickly came to bear on the stereoscopic side, where all of a sudden we went from an industry with no tools to support stereo to every product out there supporting stereo and having ways to manipulate and deal with it. As Doug said, we need these tools that allow us to go in and manipulate on a per object basis from within this data. And in certain cases, you might, because you didn't choose to shoot it a particular way, you might have to actually synthesize some motion blur to take the curse off or do certain things. But there's so much that we could do going forward, but we're just right at the very beginning of learning and dealing and experimenting directors and people have to move forward with their project. They've got to take a certain subset of the possibilities and say, these are the ones that matter to me. This is what I'm going to put into my movie. The choices made by Peter Jackson are different than the choices that Doug will make for his project and things like that. But there is a landscape of possibilities out there that's immense that we as an industry need to not lose sight of.
Well, as Doug's emphasized, it's about bringing showmanship and spectacle back to the theatrical experience. I'd like to.
There's kind of a terror going on amongst certain crowds in the industry, at the Academy or the SMPTE or the exhibition community, where movie attendance is dropping dramatically. People are looking at movies on iPads and computers and cell phones, and if we want the movie industry as a theatrical large screen industry to prevail, we've got to do something that offers a spectacle that may limit the type of movies that are right for spectacles, you know. We should get David Lean to come back, you know,
Exactly.
make some more spectacles for us, because there aren't many directors that actually think in those terms. They don't think about giant vistas of deserts with, you know, 2-pixel high camels off in the distance, because they don't care.
It came from music videos.
So we need to develop a new language. I think that's what my jag is.
I'd like to open it up to questions now. We bring up the house lights and.
Yeah. A shortage of mics.
The innovations mentioned help get closer to the resolution of what a human can perceive. I still see one problem in the fact that as long as it's a 2D projection, that the eye focuses on the same depth, although there's different depths in the stereoscopic illusion. Do you see this as a problem, or maybe is this irrelevant for the effect of immersion?
I think there's a very big difference, and I don't know whether I would say it's a problem or not, but there's clearly a big difference in what could be perceived of as the stereoscopic to the home set of situations and stereoscopic on the large screen. On the large screen, you're looking far enough away, typically, that your area of convergence and your place where you're focusing tends to not drive you quite as hard, or the brain as hard, as when you're in if you were looking at your iPad that 3 feet away, or 2 feet away, so that you had the right kind of field of view, then you're focused extremely close, but you're being asked to converge at perhaps a much more substantial difference. So I think the issue is actually more problematic for the dealing with, well, I wouldn't call it the home, but the explosion of deliverable devices that the materials have to go on to, whether they're mobile or home or any of the rest of that. And I think that's a very large challenge. In terms of what happens in the theater, I think if we can get high dynamic range and higher frame rate tools in the hands of people, there will be many stories where that is more than immersive enough, where it really feels like you're actually there without having to have the stereo component. There'll be other stories where the stereo component is critical.
Right.
Hello, I have not been at NAB, but I read an announcement about a laser projector projecting at 120 frames per second and doing simultaneously 3D images. Would this solve a lot of your problems you discussed?
Well, my experience so far is that laser projectors are on their way from all the major projector companies. They're really not substantially different from any other projector because the imager part of the projector is the same. It may be a DLP chip or an LCOS chip or whatever, and it's oscillating at the same frame rates and everything. It's just that the source of light is a laser source rather than a lit xenon lamp. My experience has been that there are tremendous advantages to lasers because the color is pure. If you want vivid blues or vivid reds, lasers can deliver that in a way that xenon lamps cannot. And the fact that lasers have less thermal energy, they're actually able to deliver a higher level of illumination on the screen without blowing up the DLP chips in the projector. Because there's a heating, there's a thing called étendue, which is a heat flux per square centimeter problem. Because if you put too much light on a DLP chip and you don't increase the size of the chip, it just can't absorb the heat and it will melt down. So that's been the upper limiting factor in most projectors, is thermal energy. So my experience so far with the brightest one I've seen is the Barco laser projector, which is a prototype. It's a powerful gas laser pumped projector, which is delivering roughly double the lumens. And it looks great. It doesn't matter, the frame rate is a completely independent function. Christie has lasers in the pipeline, and they're going at it very methodically because they know they have to productize it. They have to make a product that will possibly even be compatible to convert older projectors to laser illumination, which is going to be a great benefit because there's a lot of projectors out in the field that, believe me, the theater owners don't want to buy any more projectors right now.
Yeah.
They're kind of had it.
Want to pay for the ones they have. Yeah.
In terms of the brightness issue, when complaining about 3D, the glass.
He doesn't have a.
You can repeat the question.
It's okay, I'm okay.
People complaining about the brightness of 3D, does lasers offer a,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
I think it can help a lot.
help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
There's-
actually cheaper to fix the screen than it is to fix the projector, but that's another issue. I'm trying to bring that back into the fray because the Taurus screen that I've built with Stuart Film Screen is nothing new. It's been around for 30 years. It just needs to be brought back into the present business mind consciousness that it's an option for a theater to put in a high gain screen that's hemispherically curved to regain the light loss through polarization.
Yeah.
Or dichroics, whatever you want to use.
There is one disadvantage with typical, I mean, there are plenty of challenges to get laser projectors viable commercially. But one of the challenges that is likely to remain once they solve the speckle and other issues that they have great innovations happening in right now is that with very narrow band devices, every individual sees the color differently. And so you can have two people looking at the same thing, and one goes, those shadows are extremely green, and somebody else says, no, those shadows are extremely red. Ultimately, we make these movies to be the way they look, to look ideal to the director. And if we have a director who's yellow deficient or something, not enough to cause a problem in normal technology, he will have the look and the style dialed a particular way, and no one else in the world will see that color. So that's one of the challenges, to try to figure out how to put broader spectrum light sources behind driving things with, laser technology, mixing and maxing other wavelengths, and perhaps having more than 3 primaries is how the display is done.
So basically, we have to overcome one of the advantages of lasers.
Yes.
The advantage is that the lasers are very narrow band, and that's what's the problem in this case. So one solution would be to go for multiple lasers, let's say 15 lasers or something. Then the distribution problem for the audience or for the spectators is not so demanding anymore, but it's a matter of effort, how many lasers you put in. And of calibration, of course.
I think ultimately, if exhibition survives and we have it, what we will see is a transition to some form of active screen that, that gets manufactured with a degree of precision and resolution that's much smaller than any of the outdoor advertising displays or anything that you see currently. The advantage of that is as the screen gets larger, the resolution goes up. So if you keep trying to build for this idea of spectacle, as screens really go back, hopefully, to having that field of view that Doug has talked about, pumping more and more and more light through a small window aperture is a losing battle. And ultimately, I think we'll see screen technologies that are emissive and active at the point of the screen. And that, I think, opens up all sorts of other possibilities, again, in terms of the language and vocabulary. Because then we could actually be flashing different parts of the screen at different rates. So not only could we have variable frame rate on per element on the taking side, we could conceivably be dealing with variable frame rate on the display side that would complicate the language and vocabulary even more.
We are not talking about other aspects mainly on this panel rather than higher frame rates. But as we said several times before, all these quality parameters are interlinked with each other. And Ray, you mentioned higher dynamic range. So one of the limitations with the current projection systems is that the light scattered back from the audience to the screen kills your contrast ratio. So if you want to have high dynamic range images on the screen, you either need to crank up the gain, like in the suggestion that Doug presented, or if you go to active displays, like monitors are, then you can control the contrast ratio in a much more degree than you can do in reflective systems.
One of the things, of course, is if you go with brighter displays and you're using that for the realism of the specular highlights and the other stuff, the rate at which the number of photons that reflect off the screen as you're adding this extra, if you had a 120-foot Lambert screen and you were still keeping flesh tones within a stop of where they are now on the screen, the perceived contrast that you pick up with the extended dynamic range goes up faster than the added spill light, because the percentage of the image that is actually the super bright part of the image is phenomenally low. The number of pixels that really need that in order to give you this real sense of immersion and the like. So one gain is, I mean, higher brightness projectors are also a requirement in order to get the contrast that we really need going forward. Digital cinema projectors are at the bare minimum tolerable level of audience contrast perception. They crossed that threshold, and then the studios went, great, let's put them all in. So we're at the very beginning stages of some of these things. Jeff has a question. Here comes your microphone, Jeff. Behind you.
I'll stand up so you can see me. First off, I wish I were half as smart as any one of the three of you. So we're talking about an industry now that, let's call it 112 years old, effectively, with no significant changes in it than a lens here, a brighten a bulb here, and that every solution that has been done has been like a Goldberg's machine where they've just stuck something else on it. And what you're all discussing is a completely new thing to enjoy new kinds of storytelling in a new way, but we're trying to do it through the conglomeracy of the studio system. So what I would like to ask each of you is, in your own way, could you imagine for us how to get this done in the future so that we can actually get there in our lifetimes?
Do you feel lucky? Yeah. Actually, the jury's out. A lot of people think the industry won't be able to make those changes, that it will have very severe, painful repercussions. And although the industry is as old as you say, we've been through some pretty major shakeups. I mean, the transition from silent to sound, many studios did not survive. Many actors were unable to make the transition. It's not inconceivable we'll see massive wholesale upheaval in the business models that are what it is. Because it's clear there's plenty of things right now that are broken, that we get around. They're masked by tax incentives and ways to get things financed and abusive practices towards some of the practitioners who are carrying the burden of supporting the industry with inappropriate working conditions and the like. It's extremely problematic. But it's not just these new technologies that are putting huge pressures on this business model, as you point out. It's going to change whether we try to fix the pictures or not. So the motivation for me is, try to invent the things that could make a difference if other people who worry about many of those core things are able to chart a path through. I'm fascinated by the geeky parts of what it is that we do and trying to invent the next ways movies might be made. But if we can cross that chasm or not is it's hard to say. Doug's suffered through.
Movies are a business, and the movie studios are in the business of producing a popular product at the lowest possible cost and creating the greatest revenue they possibly can. And the exhibitors are in the process of, they're basically the retailers of that segment of revenues. But it's important to just understand that roughly 75% of the revenues from a movie do not come from movie theaters, come from television and downloading and all the other electronic media outlets. And so in the 40s, movies had 100% of the box office because there were no televisions. Television came in, and it just eroded it and eroded it around. So the ratio between theatrical release and electronic distribution continues to change. The studios, I don't think they're going to really care as long as their revenues stay strong. They don't care how it's displayed. So the studios don't seem to care very much about how movies are exhibited. They leave that to the exhibitors. The exhibitors don't really care very much about it either because they're not responsible for the product, and they're already being stretched and under a lot of pressure because attendance is down and they don't have the money to capitalize new equipment. So there's a lot of stress going on out there, and I understand that very much. But I think that change is inevitable, and I like to think that at least there's always going to be a diversity of outlet types. There's always going to be an IMAX or an IMAX alternative or something for the giant screen, and people will pay a premium, and people will they'll pay extra to see 3D because I'd like to see 3D rather than 2D because 3D is not coming through their laptop yet, etc. I just think it's a moving target. But it really is important. I mean, I've had my own stresses in all this because the studios have never invested in me technologically. Any technological thing I ever did, I had to sneak it under the rug to build a new camera or a new motion control rig or get a new lens for the optical printer. The studios did not want to know about it. And it's been a very hard climb all these years to get anything good done because you're kind of going against their will.
Working for a manufacturer or hardware manufacturer or solution provider these days, we clearly have a technology drive in our company. So of course we are looking in the market to see what filmmakers request. We are clearly listening and closely listening to filmmakers, to producers, to directors, what their needs are. But on the other side, we are researching what the technological capabilities are. And just to give you an example, when we brought the Alexa to the market, we had a clear understanding that dynamic range is more important than the number of pixels. And we think that the higher dynamic range that an Alexa can capture is of advantage for production today because you can use the higher dynamic range in everyday production without going to a high dynamic range display in the way that you can compensate for, or let's say you can work faster on set because you can do more compensation work or timing in the color timing process. So there is already a benefit of technological improvements in today's production. And of course, you're always trying to look over the edge and see where things are moving. from the technological side, but also from the expectation from the filmmakers and from the audience. And I would also say that as a hardware manufacturer who wants to make business with the cameras we produce, we are not fixed. We are, how to put it, we are part of the motion picture industry. We want to provide best solutions to filmmakers, but we know that our products would also be well used in a similar industry like broadcast or medical imaging, surveillance imaging, other areas. So we always have a little bit a wider view what kind of technologies we want to put into our products. And if there is a new sense and community that tries to drive those technologies to a new specification, then we are willing to participate in that. But we, as a rather small company compared to other companies who have not dictated but told a lot in the industry in the past how things have to be done and what is best and what not, we are not in that position to dominate the industry. We are just contributing to it.
Well, I mean, Eric could have made a decision not to go into the digital camera business. I'm sure it was a very wrenching transition for Eric to get there.
It definitely was, and I think it was a wise decision to take that transition.
Yeah.
You'd be retired
And,
otherwise,
and
yeah.
like Christie used to be all 35 millimeter sprocketed mechanical projectors, which is a completely different creature from a digital projector. Different manufacturing processes, different scientific talents, different everything. But they successfully made that transition. So all these things are moving targets.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Very enlightening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, we're going to reconvene in the morning at the Gloria 1 Theater at 9 o'clock to see some of the RE footage. Thank you.